Normandy in summer 1944 set the conditions for a battle of encirclement that neither side initially sought, and both eventually recognized as decisive. After the D-Day landings on the 6th June, Allied forces expanded beachheads at Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword into a single lodgment spanning roughly 80 to 100 kilometers of coast. By late July, 21st Army Group under General Bernard Montgomery controlled the northern sector with British 2nd Army, Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, and the newly activated Canadian 1st Army, Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, while in the west, U.S. 1st Army, General Omar Bradley, held Cottonton and the St. Louis sector. On 1st August, U.S. 3rd Army, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, became operational as Bradley assumed command of 12th Army Group. Allied manpower in Normandy reached several 100,000 in June and crossed 1 million in July. By early August, more than 35 divisions were ashore, supported by thousands of aircraft from 9th Air Force and RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force. Logistics flowed through temporary harbors and captured ports. The surviving Mulberry at Arromanches, the partially restored Cherbourg, seized 26 June, and a growing web of beach pipelines and dumps that fed artillery and armored formations poised for mobile operations once the Bocage Belt was breached. Yash facing them, Army Group B under Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, also serving as Oberbefehlshaber West after Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's dismissal, held Normandy with 7th Army and Panzer Group West, redesignated 5th Panzer Army in early August under General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel's predecessor, General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach. German order of battle comprised more than 20 divisions in the sector, including several Panzer and Panzergrenadier formations such as 2nd Panzer, 116th Panzer, Panzerlehr, 1st SS Panzer Leibstandarte, 2nd SS Panzer, das Reich, and 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend. Operational tank strength fluctuated with attrition and repair cycles. Daily returns in mid-July commonly listed a few hundred runners theater-wide, with individual divisions fielding 30 or 80 operational tanks and assault guns. Luftwaffe strength over Normandy was limited by fuel, pilot losses, and Allied airfields established on the lodgment, yielding local Allied air superiority that constrained daylight movement for German columns and supply. Terrain and doctrine shaped expectations. The bocage, sunken lanes, hedgerows, and small fields favored defense and localized ambush. German infantry, supported by anti-tank guns and mortars, exacted high costs for each kilometer. Allied units adapted with hedgerow cutters, close air support, and artillery time-on-target techniques. Operationally, Montgomery's June-July strategy fixed German armored reserves against the British-Canadian front around Caen through a sequence of set-piece battles, Perch, Epsom, Charnwood, Goodwood, Atlantic, and Spring, while U.S. forces sought a breakout in the west. Operation Cobra, launched 25 to 27 July after a concentrated bomber preparation, punched through at St. Lo and opened the Avranches Gateway. The prospect of a mobile campaign emerged. U.S. armored divisions could turn into Brittany and pivot southeast, threatening German rear areas and the lateral roads sustaining the Caen front. Intelligence fed planning on both sides but did not eliminate risk. Allied ultra-decrypts and air reconnaissance tracked German redeployments and fuel shortages. German staffs, reading the pattern of British-Canadian attacks near Caen, anticipated continued pressure there and underestimated the speed with which U.S. forces could exploit Cobra. Hitler's directives constrained German freedom of action. Orders to hold ground and counterattack to the sea limited the option of an early, orderly withdrawal to the Seine. Public sentiment tracked these constraints unevenly. In France, civilian populations in Normandy endured bombardment and artillery exchanges that destroyed towns such as Caen and Saint-Lô. In Germany, communiques stressed defensive valor and promised counterblows while the home front absorbed news of heavy losses in the west, alongside reports from the Eastern Front. By the first week of August, the strategic balance tilted. U.S. 7th Corps seized Avranches on 30th July. 8 Corps and 15th Corps fanned into Brittany and toward Le Mans. British-Canadian operations contained German armor east of the Orne, tying down formations needed against the American advance. In response, Hitler ordered a counterstroke, Operation Lüttich, aimed from the Mortagne area toward Avranches to cut Patton's corridor and restore a continuous German front to the sea. The attack, initiated 7th of August, committed armored elements including 2nd Panzer, 2nd SS Panzer das Reich, 1st SS Panzer Leibstandarte, and 116th Panzer, supported by remnants of Panzer Lehr and infantry divisions. This decision set in motion a sequence that would generate the Falaise encirclement. As German mobile forces drove west under heavy air interdiction and U.S. resistance around Hill 314, Allied corps prepared converging advances from the south and north to close behind them. Supply realities were decisive. Allied truck columns expanded daily lift from beaches in Cherbourg to forward depots, enabling sustained artillery fires and fuel for armored exploitation. German logistics struggled to maintain even modest tonnage to frontline units due to rail disruption, bridge destruction, and air attack on road movements. Fuel allotments limited the duration and reach of counterattacks. Command and control also diverged. Allied armies operated within a growing field telephone and wireless net, with forward air controllers linking ground units to fighter bombers. German staffs coped with severed lines and intermittent radio, complicating coordination among dispersed battle groups. The Falaise region, bounded by Argentan to the south, Falaise to the north, and the Dives and Orne valleys, offered both opportunity and danger. To Allied planners, it was the hinge where Canadian First Armies advanced south through Falaise, British thrusts east of the Orne, and U.S. drives northeast from Le Mans could trap large elements of 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. To German commanders, it was the corridor through which remnants might withdraw toward the Seine if a counterattack failed. By mid-August, estimates placed more than 2,000 German personnel in the threatened bulge, including combat divisions, service troops, and headquarters elements. Allied formations committed to the encirclement numbered well over 3,000 Sparsuers across multiple corps. The stage was set for a battle defined by converging attacks, air interdiction, contested river crossings, and the narrowing of escape routes into lanes of destruction, the context in which the Falaise pocket would be formed, contested, and, within days, closed. The opening phase began with two opposite movements set only days apart. On 7th of August 1944, Army Group B launched Operation Lüttich from the Mortagne area toward Avranches. The aim was to sever the U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies at the neck of the corridor and restore a continuous German front to the sea. Command passed from Field Marshal Günther von Kluge to General Heinrich Eberbach for the armored grouping, with 7th Army under Colonel General Paul Hauser holding the western arc and 5th Panzer Army elements reinforcing the thrust. Units allocated included 2nd Panzer Division, 116th Panzer Division, remnants of Panzer Lehr, and SS formations. 1st SS Panzer and 2nd SS Panzer, supported by infantry divisions and corps-level artillery. Operational strengths varied by day, but after weeks of attrition, most armored divisions committed 40 to 90 running tanks and assault guns, with limited fuel and spares. Luftwaffe support was minimal. Jagdgeschwader sorties were constrained by fuel and Allied airfields close to the front. Allied command structure on 7 to 10 August placed U.S. 1st Army, Omar Bradley, along the Mortain-Saint-Hilaire sector, and U.S. 3rd Army, George S. Patton, pivoting east from Le Mans. North of Caen, 21st Army Group, Bernard Montgomery, directed British 2nd Army, Miles Dempsey, and Canadian 1st Army, Harry Crerar. Tactical air coordination linked 9th Air Force and RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force to forward air controllers within Corps headquarters. Allied armored divisions, such as the U.S. 3rd and 4th Armored, had refueled after Cobra and carried sufficient 75mm and 76mm ammunition for sustained engagements, while artillery groups could mass hundreds of guns for time-on-target missions. The combined chiefs and Schaff had already defined a broad encirclement concept: hold German armor on the British-Canadian front, advance U.S. forces deep into the German rear toward Argentan and the Seine, then turned north to meet Canadian advances south of Falaise. Lutik's first day produced an incursion several kilometers deep under early morning fog. German columns reached Saint-Barthélemy and pushed toward Juvigny-le-Tertre and Mortain. On Hill 314 above Mortain, companies of the U.S. 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry, 30th Infantry Division maintained an observation and blocking position that coordinated divisional artillery throughout 7 to the 12th of August. 2 U.S. armored divisions and attached tank destroyer battalions counterattacked along road nets to contain penetrations. As fog lifted, Allied fighter bombers and medium bombers interdicted routes from Saint-Hilaire and Barenton. German reports recorded vehicle losses and delays from air attack and artillery, and fuel shortages limited repeated thrusts. By 9 to 10, August Ludish had failed to cut the corridor, though it fixed several panzer divisions in the Mortain area. At the moment, U.S. columns gained speed south and east. While Ludish unfolded, the northern pincer formed. Canadian First Army opened Operation Totalize on the night of 7 to 8 August, driving south from the Caen-Verrières line toward Falaise with 2 Canadian Corps, Lieutenant General Guy Simons. The attack combined armored columns, infantry and armored carriers, and a heavy bomber lift that targeted German strong points along the Caen-Falaise road. Opposing forces included 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend, 1st SS Panzer Leibstandarte elements, and infantry divisions deployed on rolling ground south of Caen. Gains reached 7 to 12 kilometers in the first 48 hours. Counterattacks by 12th SS Panzer and 85th Infantry Division slowed the advance on the Laison Valley. By 10th August, Canadian units were positioned north of Falaise but short of the town. Reserves were organizing for a renewed push once artillery and logistics caught up. U.S. mobile operations shaped the southern jaw. Patton's Third Army, activated 1st of August, drove from Le Mans toward Argentan with 15th Corps, Wade Heislip, and Exquet Corps, Walton Walker, while 20th Corps, Manton Eddy, secured the flank. On 12th to 13th August, 15th Corps reached the outskirts of Argentan after battles at Alençon and Sées, having advanced more than 80 to 100 kilometers in a week. Tank and mechanized infantry battalions operated with ample fuel lifted by Red Ball Express truck columns. Artillery groups leapfrogged forward observation posts to maintain pressure on German columns attempting to withdraw east. German rearguards, including 9th Panzer Division elements and ad hoc Kampfgruppen, contested river bridges and road junctions to buy time for 7th Army units west of Falaise. At the Army group level, command decisions diverged under pressure. Klug's orders, following Führer directives, still prioritized counterattack and holding ground. Requests from field commanders to withdraw behind the Orne and Dives met delays. On 15th August, Klug was relieved. General Feldmarschall Walter Model assumed Oberbefehlshaber West and Army Group B, inheriting a compressed timeline and fragmented formations. Model sought to extract as many troops as possible east toward the Seine, while establishing blocking positions around Troon, Chambois, and Vimoutier. On the Allied side, Bradley on 13th of August restricted 15th Corps at Argentan to avoid intermingling with Canadian forces approaching from the north. Montgomery's directive called for Canadian First Army to take Falaise and pivot toward Troon, while U.S. forces swung northeast to seal the lower arc. The pause at Argentan remains a subject of operational debate, but within 48 to 72 hours, the converging plan was re-energized with new orders to close the gap along the Dives. Civilian environments complicated every movement. Towns along Canadian axes, Mets-sur-Orne, Potigny, Bretteville-sur-Lez, contained displaced residents and destroyed infrastructure. French authorities and resistance groups provided route intelligence and guarded bridges from demolition when possible. In the south, traffic jams of refugees mixed with German columns retreating through Alençon and Argentan, increasing exposure to air attack despite Allied attempts to signal target identification procedures to pilots. Medical services on both sides expanded triage near road nets. Allied field hospitals reported rising admissions of blast and burn injuries linked to munitions and air attack, while German medical columns struggled with fuel and vehicle shortages. By 14-15 August, the opening phase had set the geometry of the pocket. Canadian formations pressed toward Falaise. British units east of the Orne tied down German armor near Troarn and Mézidon. U.S. 15th Corps faced Argentan with orders to pivot, and Model attempted to extract 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army through a narrowing corridor bounded by the Dives Valley and high ground near Troon. Estimates placed 100,000–15,000 German troops west of the Argentan-Falaise line at mid-month, with additional units in depth. Allied forces in the converging jaws exceeded 300,000 combat troops across U.S., British, Canadian, and Polish formations, backed by artillery groupings that could mass hundreds of guns per army and by tactical air fleets generating thousands of sorties over the week. The conditions for encirclement now existed. A failed counterstroke at Mortagne had fixed mobile divisions. A southern thrust reached Argentan. A northern thrust stood before Falaise, and German command faced the dual task of holding blocking positions while orchestrating a withdrawal through a corridor that each day became shorter and more dangerous. Strategic intent diverged sharply after the first week of August. For the Allies, Montgomery's directive was to convert the failed German counterstroke into an encirclement west of the Seine. Canadian First Army would seize Falaise and drive on Troon. British Second Army would contain and press east of the Orne, and U.S. forces would pivot from Le Mans toward Argentan and then northeast to close the lower arc. The desired end state was a continuous Allied front from Falaise through Argentan to Alençon, with mobile corps squeezing eastward to the Dives crossings. Bradley's 12th Army Group issued corps objectives that prioritized road junctions, bridgeheads, and ground commanding the Chambois-Troon corridor. Patton's 3rd Army was instructed to protect its east flank, while 5th Viking Corps advanced on Argentan. D'Extieux and Feuillinger Corps were to guard lines of communication and threaten the lower Seine to dilute German options. German planning, altered by command change on 15th August, aimed to extract the bulk of 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army to the Seine while holding a shield against Allied thrusts. Model's staff identified the Troon-Chambois-Vimoutiers axis as the evacuation corridor and assigned blocking tasks to available armored and infantry formations. Improvised Kampfgruppen, built from 2nd Panzer, 9th Panzer, 116th Panzer, remnants of Panzer Lehr, and SS divisions, were to hold hinge points long enough for service troops and artillery trains to pass east. Rear services were ordered to destroy depots west of the Orne and to keep bridgeheads over the Dives open with pontoon and engineer assets. The operational risk lay in fuel. Daily returns showed many divisions with 30-70 operational tanks and assault guns and limited gasoline stocks, a constraint that forced night moves and short counterattacks rather than continuous retreat covered by armor. Logistics determined feasible tempo. On the Allied side, the reopening of Cherbourg allowed daily tonnage to rise steeply after 26 July. Arromanches Mulberry, beach pipelines, and forward depots sustained artillery expenditure and fuel for exploitation. Truck pools built ad hoc before the formal express system began later in August shuttled gasoline and ammunition along one-way loops to corps dumps near Alençon and Le Mans. Artillery plans specified hundreds of guns per army for time on target shoots. Corps fire direction centers coordinated with air liaison to switch from counter-mobility, bridge cuts, road craters, to anti-column strikes as German movement concentrated. Canadian First Army allocated heavy bomber lifts for set-piece attacks opening each thrust south of Caen and later for tractable, with follow-on medium and fighter bomber sorties keyed to road nets north of Falaise. German supply ran on a narrower margin. Allied air superiority forced daylight dispersal. Movement of bulk fuel and ammunition occurred at night on secondary roads, with field dumps established in orchards and hedgerows east of Argentan and north of Falaise. Railway interdiction east of the Orne degraded replenishment from the Seine sector. Ammunition tables were cut in several divisions to maintain minimum stocks for anti-tank and defensive artillery. Luftwaffe requests for aviation fuel competed with panzer needs and were rarely met at planned levels. Engineer regiments carried prefabricated trestles and pontoons to replace destroyed bridges on the dives, but shortages of tractors and prime movers slowed site changes and recovery of damaged armor. Doctrinal choices reflected these constraints. Allied operations emphasized corps-level maneuver, anchored by divisional artillery and close air support. U.S. armored divisions advanced in combat commands with tank infantry engineer teams, keeping 105mm and 155mm howitzers within range of daily objectives. Canadian doctrine for night start lines and armored infantry columns sought to bypass village strongpoints and seize ridge lines south of Caen before first light, then consolidate under bomber-cut corridors. British units east of the Orne fixed German armor with deliberate brigade attacks, enabling the Canadian thrust to gain depth without exposing its right. Air-ground doctrine matured. Forward air controllers moved with leading brigades. Cab ranks of fighter bombers orbited highways from Argentan to Falaise, striking columns called in by code from corps nets. German doctrine, adjusted by model, prioritized elastic shields and localized counterattack to keep exits open. Kampfgruppen with a Panzer battalion, a Panzer Grenadier battalion, a battery of 105mm or 150mm howitzers, and assault guns were tasked to hold road villages and ridge spurs, counterpunch at dawn or dusk, and fall back when flanked. Anti-aircraft guns were sighted to cover choke points. 88mm pieces doubled as anti-tank in ambushes along sunken lanes. Command posts displaced frequently to avoid artillery and air attack. Runners and motorcycle messengers substituted for cut lines. The doctrine accepted that battalions would be reduced quickly, but aimed to preserve cadres for reconstitution east of the Seine. Preparations on each side targeted critical ground. For the Allies, Argentan's road hub, Falaise's approaches, and the bridges at Saint-Lambert, Chambois, and Moissy were mapped as decision points. Canadian II Corps rehearsed control of mixed columns, including 4th Canadian Armored Division and the 1st Polish Armored Division, the latter slated to exploit toward Trun once Falaise fell. U.S. 15 Corps compiled bridge repair packages for the Orne and Sarthe tributaries to keep advance guards moving. Signals earmarked extra radio nets for inter-army boundary coordination to prevent fratricide as the jaws closed. German staffs, for their part, stockpiled smoke, mines, and bridging gear near Vimoutiers. Road military police regulated priority columns, artillery first, then service units, with tanks covering flanks. Demolition plans specified charges for fuel dumps and ammunition parks west of the dives to prevent capture. Miscalculations influenced the timetable. Allied assessments underestimated the time needed for Canadian forces to take and clear Falaise's approaches under persistent counterattacks and restricted roads. U.S. planners debated the risks of pushing Kifraimbi's corps beyond Argentan without a firm boundary arrangement, leading to the 13 August halt order. German command delayed a general withdrawal behind the dives, counting on Luttich to relieve pressure and on fuel deliveries that did not materialize. Several panzer divisions consumed their remaining gasoline in counterattacks that retook ridge points but did not reopen maneuver space. Luftwaffe sortie expectations were not met. Weather windows and fuel shortages limited sustained cover for retreating columns. Propaganda framed these moves for home fronts and troops. German radio announced local successes at Mortagne and emphasized defensive steadfastness while minimizing the scale of the developing encirclement. Allied briefings highlighted the containment of Luttich, the capture of Le Mans and Alençon, and the approach to Falaise. Public communiqué avoided premature claims of a complete pocket until bridges on the dive were either held or destroyed. French resistance networks distributed leaflets directing civilians away from main roads and reported German demolition parties and traffic flows to Allied liaison officers. By 15-16 August, the planning cycle had converged on closure tasks. Canadian First Army prepared Operation Tractable to break into Falaise and turn on Trun. Polish First Armored was assigned the axis toward Chambois once the town fell. Bradley authorized 15th Corps to face northeast from Argenton toward the Dives line when coordination with Canadian forces allowed, while 3rd Army's other corps secured flanks. Model issued night march orders to push as many units as possible through Vimoutiers and Troun, holding Chambois and Saint-Lambert as keys. The competing objectives were now explicit. Allied armies sought to compress, interdict, and seal crossings with artillery and air. German commands sought to meter formations east through a corridor that narrowed each day, accepting loss in rear guards to save headquarters, artillery, and as many infantry battalions as fuel and road space would allow. The clash assumed two distinct forms between 7 and 16 August 1944, a concentrated German thrust at Mortagne that collided with layered U.S. defenses under constant air attack, and a pair of Canadian-led set-piece operations south of Caen that began to pry open the approaches to Falaise. At Mortagne on 7th of August, armored spearheads from 2nd Panzer, 1st SS Panzer, 2nd SS Panzer, and 116th Panzer advanced under morning fog along the Saint-Hilaire-Mortain roads, pushing several kilometers before organized resistance coalesced. Companies from the U.S. 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division, occupied Hill 314 as an observation and blocking post, directing Corps artillery fires that repeatedly halted columns on the slopes and road nets below. By midday, the fog lifted, and 9th Air Force fighter bombers began a cycle of attacks on march groups, fuel trucks, and defensive concentrations. German unit logs for 8-9 August recorded delays from bomb damage, craters, and fuel shortages that limited renewed efforts to cut the Avranches' neck. U.S. counterattacks with elements of the 3rd Armored Division and attached tank destroyer battalions retook road junctions around Juvigny and Saint Barthélemy, while artillery massed for time-on-target strikes that broke up infantry tank groups at the hedgerow line. By 10th of August, the Lüttich penetration had been contained. The German armored grouping remained fixed around Mortagne, exactly where Allied planners preferred their mobile formations to be as wider movements unfolded. North of the Orne, 2 Canadian Corps opened Operation Totalize on the night of 7th to 8th of August, with a heavy bomber preparation along the Caen-Falaise road. Armored columns, built around 4th Canadian Armored Division, British 51st, Highland Division, and independent brigades, advanced behind barrage lanes cut through the countryside. The first 24-48 hours yielded gains of 7 to 12 kilometers, capturing positions such as Cramonil and Saint-Aignan-de-Cramonil, and pushing south toward Bretteville-sur-Lez. Resistance centered on the 12th SS Panzer's counterattacks, and surviving elements of 89th and 85th Infantry Divisions, which used reverse slopes and anti-tank belts to stall advances on the Laizon Valley. The Canadian attack, designed to bypass village strongpoints, nonetheless slowed, where narrow roads restricted armor and where counterattacks struck exposed flanks at first light. By $10 August, the front stabilized north of Falaise. The town remained out of reach pending a second set-piece effort. While Totalize fixed German armor east of the Laizon, U.S. forces accelerated south and east. 5th Corps seized Alençon on 12th of August after engagements that dislodged 9th Panzer, covering forces and overran service units moving north. The pace, 8,100 kilometers in a week, owed to road control and logistics. Corps truck columns lifted fuel and 105mm and 155mm ammunition from depots near Le Mans. Field artillery leapfrogged observation posts to keep pressure on retreating battle groups. At Argentan on 13th of August, forward elements of the 5th Armored Division and 79th Infantry Division reached the outskirts and probed east. Orders from 12th Army Group held them short to avoid confusion with Canadian advances closing from the north. German rearguards set ambushes at stream crossings and village exits to delay any immediate turn toward the Dives. Civilian environments complicated every movement. In the Canadian sector, the bombardment corridor produced fires and rubble along the Caen-Falaise road. Columns detoured around roadblocks where buildings had collapsed into narrow streets. In the U.S. sector, refugees mixed with retreating German troops on lateral roads out of Argentan and Say, increasing vulnerability to air attack, despite Allied attempts to refine recognition signals for columns. French resistance groups reported on demolition parties and identified fordable points along the Dives and Orne. In several villages, local authorities sequestered bridges or removed charges when German engineers dispersed. On the 14th of August, the 2nd Canadian Corps began Operation Tractable with a revised scheme. A daytime start under smokescreens to reduce the risk of night disorientation, a bomber concentration on known strongpoints, and armored infantry columns aimed directly at Falaise. The attack progressed several kilometers, crossing the Liaison at selected points and taking positions north and northwest of the town. German counterattacks by 12th SS Panzer and remnants of Panzer Lehr struck at the shoulders, attempting to split the columns and retake ridgelines that commanded the approaches. Canadian artillery adjusted with short, dense concentrations. Armored regiments employed 17-pounder and 75mm guns in overwatch, while infantry cleared hedgerow enclosures and farmyards that had been fortified as company strongpoints. By nightfall on 15th of August, Canadian units entered Falaise's outskirts. Street fighting and demolition charges slowed the clearance, but by 16th of August, the town was in Allied hands, opening the axis toward Trône. Unexpected outcomes accompanied these first engagements. The Mortagne thrust, intended to restore a line to the sea, instead immobilized several panzer divisions under an air umbrella that denied them the freedom to maneuver or resupply. Totalize yielded significant ground, but did not collapse the German front in one blow. Counterattacks recovered time and imposed a higher-than-planned expenditure of ammunition and bridging equipment for Canadian formations. In the south, the pause at Argentan prevented an immediate interlock, but also avoided inter-army confusion as Canadian and Polish forces prepared to drive on Trône and Chambois. German commanders, confronting simultaneous pressure on three axes, shifted to an evacuation geometry. Keep the Trône-Vimoutiers road net open, hold Chambois and Saint-Lambert as keys, and meter units east through the narrowing gap. Air-ground interaction defined the tempo of these clashes. 9th Air Force and RAF, 2nd Tactical Air Force generated thousands of sorties across the week. Fighter bombers attacked columns identified by controllers with code panels and radio, while medium bombers struck road junctions and bridges behind the front. German flak concentrated at choke points inflicted losses, but the cumulative effect remained disruptive. Craters forced detours, smoke revealed columns to artillery, and destroyed fuel trucks, stranded vehicles that otherwise might have escaped. On the ground, artillery remained the decisive arm in both coalitions for shaping the engagement areas. U.S. Corps massed battalions for time-on-target barrages on Mortagne slopes. Canadian regiments walked concentrations ahead of armored infantry teams south of Caen. German batteries focused on interdiction of bridge building and on defensive belts that covered the exits toward the Dives. Medical services mirrored the intensity. U.S. field hospitals near Avranches admitted sustained numbers from 7 to 12 August, a mix of fragmentation and burn injuries linked to combined arms and air attack. Canadian casualty clearing stations moved forward behind Tractable, handling wounds from close quarters fighting in enclosed terrain. German medical columns attempted to evacuate through Argentan and Vimoutiers at night, but fuel shortages and air interdiction limited reach. Battalion aid posts stabilized many who could not be moved until routes opened after dark. By 16th of August, the first engagements had redrawn the map. The Mortagne counterstroke had failed, leaving armored divisions depleted and tied to blocking tasks. Falaise had fallen to Canadian forces, opening the road to Trône. U.S. 15 Corps held Argentan with orders to turn toward the Dives when boundary coordination allowed. German headquarters reported an estimated 15,000 troops west of a line from Falaise to Argentan. Allied commands tallied more than 3,000 troops in the converging jaws, supported by artillery groupings of several hundred guns, per army and tactical air power that limited German daylight movement. The pocket was not yet closed, but the lines of approach, the bridges to be held or destroyed, and the villages that would anchor the final battles, Trône, Chambois, Saint-Lambert, Moissy, were now selected by the momentum of events set in motion during these first 10 days. Escalation followed immediately after Falaise fell on the 16th of August 1944. 2. Canadian Corps pushed Tractable's second phase toward Troon, assigning 4th Canadian Armored Division and 3rd Canadian Infantry Division the axis south along the Lausanne and east toward the Dives crossings. The 1st Polish Armored Division assembled to exploit on the Troon-Chambois line once routes opened. Fire plans shifted from broad bombardment corridors to short, dense concentrations on ridge spurs and road junctions. Heavy bombers were withheld after early misdrops. Medium bombers and fighter bombers, instead, focused on bridges over the Ante and Dives and on traffic nodes at Troon and Vimoutier. On the 17th of August, Canadian forward units reached the Lausanne south of Falaise and began turning east. By 18th August, reconnaissance reported German columns moving northeast through Troon under smoke and intermittent flak cover. U.S. 15th Corps, held at Argentan since 13th of August, received authority on 17th of August to turn northeast. The 90th Infantry Division advanced on Le Bourg, Saint-Léonard, and Chambois, while combat command groupings from the 2nd French Armored Division and U.S. 5th Armored Division probed toward the Dives. Corps artillery leapfrogged forward observers to interdict withdrawal routes mapped by air photos the previous evening. Fuel and ammunition arrived via truck loops from depots near Le Mans and Alençon. Daily allocations supported continuous 105mm and 155mm fires and close air support during workable weather windows. The U.S. advance met delaying actions from Kampfgruppen, built around 2nd Panzer, and remnants of 9th Panzer and Panzer Lehr, companies of tanks and assault guns, Panzer Grenadiers on trucks, and 88mm guns dug in to cover village exits and fords. German command under General Feldmarschall Walter Model, in place since 15th August, issued orders to extract 7th Army, Hauser, and 5th Panzer Army, Eberbach, through a corridor bounded by Troon-Chambois-Vimoutier. Traffic control detachments prioritized artillery and service units first, infantry and headquarters next, with armor as mobile flank guards. Engineer regiments carried bridging and demolition gear. Military police directed columns at night to disperse on secondary tracks by day. The withdrawal plan faced 2 deficits: fuel and time. Many armored battalions reported fewer than 40 runners with limited gasoline. Columns advanced in short bounds, then waited for fuel trucks that did not always arrive. The corridor's width contracted daily. By 18th of August, Allied advances had reduced the exit to a band of 10-15 kilometers. By late 19th August, the usable gap narrowed to several kilometers around Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives and Chambois. Air-ground pressure intensified the crisis. 9th Air Force and RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force flew thousands of sorties in the 16 to 20 August period, with fighter bombers tasked against moving columns and medium bombers against road junctions and bridge approaches. German flak 20mm 1882 speed spared lauet millinist clustered at choke points, inflicting losses on low-flying aircraft. However, the cumulative effects of cratering, fires, and blocked vehicles slowed every march group and exposed subsequent convoys to artillery. Allied Corps, fire direction centers synchronized time-on-target missions with air reports. Batteries cut road nets behind villages just as ground troops engaged frontages. On the German side, batteries of 105mm and 150mm howitzers fired smoke to conceal crossings and laid defensive barrages along hedgerow lines covering the Moissy Ford and Saint-Lambert Bridge. Civilians experienced the escalation as routes filled with military and refugee traffic. In Troon, Chambois, and surrounding hamlets, residents sheltered in cellars while artillery and air attacks struck crossroads. French authorities and resistance groups attempted to steer civilians away from the Dives crossings. In several cases, local police removed charges from minor bridges before retreating German engineers could fire them, while other spans were blown in sequence as columns passed. Medical services on both sides expanded triage. Canadian casualty clearing stations moved forward along the Caen-Falaise road. U.S. field hospitals set up near Say and Argenton. German medical columns concentrated around WW2 for night evacuation eastward, constrained by fuel and route closures. Command friction appeared as formations converged on limited exits. On 18th August, Canadian and Polish units oriented on Trône. The Polish division was tasked to seize high ground east of the town and to push on Chambois. Delays at demolished bridges and congested approaches compressed schedules. U.S. 15th Corps attacking from Le Bourg-Saint-Léonard, coordinated boundary control to avoid intermingling with Canadian columns moving from the north. German staffs issued counterattack orders at dawn and dusk to hold shoulders of the corridor. Elements of 2nd Panzer and 12th SS Panzer struck along the dives to retake ridge points that dominated Saint-Lambert and Moissy, restoring temporary flow for night columns. These actions consumed irreplaceable fuel and vehicles. Surviving tanks were often used as stationary guns to anchor rear guards. Casualty reports from the 17 to 20 August illustrate the crisis scale. Allied returns recorded rising prisoner counts as rear guards were overrun. Thousands captured in village clearances and field surrenders on 18-19 August alone, while combat losses reflected close fighting at bridges and hedgerow approaches. German returns, fragmentary due to disrupted communications, logged heavy losses in vehicles destroyed by air attack and artillery. Battalions reported rifle strengths halved after successive counterattacks to reopen exits. Materiel wastage multiplied. Columns abandoned soft-skin vehicles out of fuel. Guns were spiked or left in ditches when tractors failed. Engineer units exhausted bridging stores on dives. Approaches blasted again within hours. Terrain defined the last kilometers. The Dives River, with floodplain meadows and tree-lined banks, funneled movement onto a few fords and bridges. Saint-Lambert, Moissy, and passages west of Chambois. Ridgelines southeast of Trône, including the height later marked as Hill 262 by the Poles, commanded road nets feeding the gap. Hedgerows and sunken lanes gave cover for ambushes, but channeled columns into predictable arcs where artillery could be pre-registered. Canadian patrols probed south of Trône. U.S. infantry entered Chambois' outskirts from the southwest on 19th August. Polish reconnaissance identified the Mont Ormel crest as the fulcrum from which to cut the last road lines east. German commanders recognized the same geometry and inserted rear guards on the crests facing west, while continuing to meter troops through the valley. Political and theater-level signals intersected with the battlefield crisis. On 17 to 19th August, news of command changes and investigations reached German headquarters. Klug, relieved earlier, died on 19th August while returning to Germany. Model retained control in the West and pressed extraction orders while refusing proposals for a general stand. Allied headquarters tracked the gap's width through air photos and ground reports. Montgomery's and Bradley's staffs reiterated the priority of sealing the exits over deep exploitation beyond the Seine until the pocket collapsed. The Canadian government followed casualty and progress reports as its army fought for Falaise and Trône. Polish command prepared communiques noting the upcoming commitment of its armored division to the key heights. By 26 August, the crisis peaked without resolution. Allied forces stood on three sides of a corridor, reduced in places to less than 5 kilmes. Canadian formations held Falaise and pressed on Trône. U.S. 15 Corps gripped Chambois' western approaches. The Polish 1st Armored Division prepared to seize the Mont Ormel ridge system. Inside the shrinking pocket, estimates still placed more than 1,000 German personnel attempting to move east, including remnants of multiple divisions, corps staffs, and services. Artillery and air continued to cut and pound the lanes. German rearguards counterattacked to keep them open by hours. The escalation phase had thus produced the conditions for a decisive closure. Converging Allied axes, a narrowed river corridor with few viable crossings, and a defending force compelled to trade organized structure for speed. The next engagements would determine whether the route to the Seine remained open for significant formations, or whether the pocket would be sealed with tens of thousands captured among the lanes between Trône, Chambois, and WW2. The campaign reached its peak between 19 and 21 August 1944, when converging Allied columns struck the last exits and German commands attempted simultaneous breakouts and withdrawals under continuous fire. On 19th August, U.S. 15th Corps drove on Chambois from the southwest with 90th Infantry Division and elements of the 2nd French Armored Division, while Canadian II Corps pressed east from Falaise toward Troon and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive. The 1st Polish Armored Division swung onto the Mont-Ormel Ridge system, east of Troon, the twin crests later known as Hill 262 North and South. These heights dominated the road complex feeding the gap. Their occupation would expose columns moving from the pocket toward Vimoutier to direct fire and artillery observation. German rearguards, Kampfgruppen from 2nd Panzer, 116th Panzer, remnants of Panzer Lehr, and 12th SS Panzer formed a screen along hedgerows and ridge spurs to keep corridors open by hours. Chambois became the hinge. During 19 to 20, August battalions of the U.S. 359th and 358th Infantry Regiments entered the town from the west and south, fighting house to clear intersections that tied roads to Saint-Lambert and Moissy. French tanks and half-tracks from the 2EDB probed east of Chambois to cut approaches, while U.S. engineers emplaced roadblocks and prepared anti-tank positions in orchards around the town. Canadian detachments from the north reached Saint-Lambert's outskirts on 19th of August. Under Major David Curry, mixed companies moved into the village on the 19th-20th, fought for the bridge and fords, and established blocking positions that fired on columns attempting to cross the dives. Prisoners taken in these engagements numbered in the thousands by the end of the 20th, with counts rising daily as isolated groups surrendered when ammunition ran low or when artillery concentrations broke up march serials. On the heights, the Polish division's commitment defined the peak's geometry. The 10th Dragoons, 1st Armored Regiment, and supporting infantry took positions along Hill 262 on 19th August, emplacing anti-tank guns to cover the road fans toward Coudhard and the Boyos farm. From these crests, Polish observers directed artillery onto streams of vehicles moving east. Fire plans coordinated with Canadian and U.S. Corps, nets cut roads, and then shifted to flanking hedgerows when columns detoured. German commands recognized the danger and organized counterattacks from both sides of the ridge. Elements of 2nd SS Panzer and 9th Panzer, with assault guns and infantry on half-tracks, struck the northern and southern approaches on 20 to 21st August, attempting to dislodge the Polish positions and reopen an uninterrupted lane. Fighting on the crest devolved into close-range exchanges at farmyards and copses, with tanks firing hull down and anti-tank guns covering dead ground between hedgerows. Air and artillery reached maximum coordination in these same hours. 9th Air Force and RAF, 2nd Tactical Air Force flew dense schedules on 19-21 August, interdicting road knots east of the pocket and striking columns identified by ground controllers. German flak at choke points, including 20mm 80mm guns sighted at hedgerow corners, inflicted losses, but the aggregated effect of craters and fires accelerated traffic collapse. Allied Corps' fire direction centers executed time-on-target missions that arrived within seconds on designated crossroads. Polish, Canadian, and U.S. observers fed corrections that walked salvos along lanes crowded with vehicles. German batteries answered with smoke barrages to screen movement and with defensive fire to support local counterattacks. But ammunition depletion reduced their ability to sustain fire beyond short bursts. Civilian conditions deteriorated as the battlefield compressed. In villages along the dives and on the ridge approaches, residents sheltered in cellars while shells and airstrikes set barns and stores alight. Columns of refugees mixed with retreating units. Allied efforts to rout civilians off main roads were only partly successful, and some were caught in artillery patterns aimed at road junctions. Field hospitals on the Allied side, U.S. stations near Say and Argentan, Canadian clearing stations along the Caen-Falaise axis, Polish aid posts on Mont-Ormel, treated rising numbers of blast, burn, and small arms wounds. German medical columns staged around Vimoutier for night evacuation. Limited by fuel and by the need to give priority to engineers and rear services moving east. Command decisions at the peak reflected the urgency. Model ordered coordinated thrusts at dawn and dusk on 20-21 August to pry open shoulders at Saint-Lambert and to push Polish lines off Hill 262. These counterattacks reached Polish and Canadian positions repeatedly, in some cases forcing temporary withdrawals from farms and copses before artillery and anti-tank fire restored the line. On the Allied side, Corps commanders prioritized holding blocking points over deeper exploitation. 15th Corps reinforced Chambois and extended contact toward the Poles. Canadian II Corps detached units to support the Saint-Lambert fight and to link with Polish positions along the ridge. Air tasking remained focused on the pocket's exits and not on targets beyond the Seine. Signal coordination across Army boundaries tightened as units from 3 national forces converged on a front of a few kilometers. Material patterns at the peak illustrate the battle's intensity. German columns abandoned large numbers of soft-skin vehicles out of fuel or blocked by craters. Tanks that could not be recovered were destroyed or left as fixed guns to anchor rear guards. Allied recovery crews worked the Chambois-Troon roads to clear lanes for their own logistics. Engineers repaired fords under fire at Saint-Lambert to maintain the pressure on the eastern exits. Ammunition expenditure in Allied artillery ran to thousands of rounds per day for medium calibers. Polish ammunition for anti-tank guns and tank main guns was rationed during the heaviest counterattacks, with resupply run at night along contested tracks. German reports recorded dwindling stocks of high-explosive and anti-tank rounds, and a shortage of bridging materials after successive demolitions and partial rebuilds on the dives. By the evening of 20th August, Allied units had physical contact on multiple axes. Patrols from the U.S. 90th Division and Polish 1st Armored met near Chambois' eastern edges. Canadian and Polish elements linked along the Mont-Ormel approaches. The gap was not yet hermetically sealed. Night movement and counterattacks still pushed groups through, but organized formations faced severe difficulty. Estimates inside the pocket suggested more than 7,000 personnel remained west of the closing line on the 20th, with thousands more in immediate depth. On the Allied side, committed combat troops around the gap numbered well over 15,000 across Canadian, Polish, British, American, and French formations, backed by artillery groupings and air fleets that could focus within a radius of 10 to 15 kilometers. The peak concluded with a sequence of fights that determined whether the exits would remain contested or closed. On 21st August, repeated German assaults against Hill 262 sought to break the Polish hold and to push a lane toward Vimoutiers. Simultaneous thrusts probed Saint-Lambert to unseat the Canadian bridgehead. Both failed to secure a sustained opening. The Polish division, though battered, held the crest with artillery support from Canadian guns. Canadian detachments at Saint-Lambert maintained the block on the dives. U.S. 15th Corps expanded its lodgment in Chambois and pushed east to tighten contact. The largest movements inside the pocket now occurred under darkness in small groups, not as organized columns. The campaign's peak had compressed the battlefield to a few ridgelines and a river crossing, fixed opposing decisions at those points, and expended the remaining mobility of formations that, days earlier, had been moving in division-sized columns. The stage was set for the final closures and for the accounting that would follow. Both coalitions adapted under compressed time and space once the exits shrank to the dives and the Mont-Ormel Ridge. German commands shifted from organized column withdrawal to decentralized breakout groups. Battalion staff split troops into march serials of 50-200 personnel, each with a few trucks, horse carts, or simply hand-carried loads. Guides who knew the hedgerows and hollow lanes led by night, hugging field boundaries and orchards to avoid artillery-registered roads. Assault guns and remaining tanks, often fewer than a dozen per Kampfgruppe, were employed as static strongpoints to cover fords and lane bends. Anti-aircraft batteries redeployed forward as ground fire support. 20mm and 37mm guns swept hedgerow gaps for infantry, while 88mm guns were sighted to create anti-tank ambush fans across likely Allied approach lines. Naval Werfer batteries fired short smoke and high explosive missions to conceal crossings, then displaced before counter-battery could register. Scarcity shaped every decision. Fuel was apportioned to engineer trucks carrying bridging or demolition gear. Medical columns piggybacked on march groups to move the most serious cases toward Vimoutier. At unit level, German improvisation was continuous. Panzer Grenadiers redistributed Panzerfausts to forward files, creating ad hoc anti-tank screens for night thrusts against roadblocks. Signals officers laid field telephone lines through farmyards to restore contact across a few kilometers. When lines failed, runners carried coordinates to batteries waiting to cover a breakout attempt. Company cooks and clerks formed rifle parties to hold flanks, while corps infantry pushed columns forward. Morale varied. Orders promised a path to the Seine if rear guards held another day. Prisoner interrogations taken by Allied units described fatigue and dwindling ammunition for machine guns and mortars, but a continued willingness to counterattack at dusk to open a lane. Allied adaptation centered on sealing tactics that economized infantry while maximizing artillery and air effects. U.S. and Canadian Corps prioritized roadblocks tied to pre-sighted fires. A platoon at a crossroads, an anti-tank gun in a hedge bay, and an observation post connected by wire or radio to battalion guns. When patrols detected movement, fire direction centers executed time-on-target missions that landed within seconds, followed by smoke to force columns into detours where additional concentrations were already plotted. Forward air controllers, operating from jeeps or half-tracks, used panel codes to call fighter bombers against strings of vehicles in the open. Where flak density was high, aircraft shifted to medium altitude and struck junctions to create craters that funneled traffic into kill zones for artillery. Engineer companies pre-built Bailey panels and fascines to restore fords for Allied movement, while denying the same to the retreat. Demolition parties blew culverts once units passed, tightening the net hour by hour. The Polish 1st Armored Division's defense on Hill 262 demonstrated layered adaptation under pressure. Tanks were positioned hull down behind crest lines with interlocking arcs. 17-pounder anti-tank guns covered dead ground between copses. Infantry held farmyards as strong points with piats and machine guns, sighted for enfilade on approach lanes. Ammunition discipline was rigid. When AP rounds ran low, tanks alternated HE to break up infantry clumps and to detonate fuel and ammunition on disabled vehicles that blocked the roads. Polish observers worked a shared fire net with Canadian artillery, shifting salvos in 100-200 meter steps as columns attempted to bypass wreckage. Medical teams created casualty points behind the crest, with stretchers routed along trenches scratched into the chalk. Night resupply moved along tracks marked by blackout lamps and guides, bringing 75mm shells, fuel in cans, and water. When counterattacks from two directions pressed the position on 20 August, Polish companies executed short counterstrokes. A platoon thrust to retake a farm, a section rushed to reoccupy a hedge gap, then fell back behind fresh anti-tank lines as artillery reimposed the barrier. Canadian detachments at Saint-Lambert applied a similar economy of force logic adapted to a river village. Roadblocks were built with knocked-out vehicles and farm carts. Anti-tank guns were dug into barnyards facing the bridge and the ford. A small reserve patrolled house to catch infiltrators who slipped through during barrages. Fire plans integrated with U.S. and Polish observers to strike the far bank and road approaches whenever smoke lifted. Prisoners were processed in batches under shelling. Each lull allowed movement of wounded across the bridge to aid posts in Falaise. The detachment's endurance relied on rapid repair of gun carriages and the ability to swap breech blocks and sights between pieces damaged by splinters, maintenance improvisations typical of the weak. U.S. formations around Chambois adapted to mixed nationality coordination. Liaison officers from the Polish division rode with 90th Infantry patrols to deconflict arcs. French tanks from 2EDB filled gaps in the anti-tank screen on the town's eastern exits. Artillery surveyed switch positions, so batteries could fire north in support of Saint-Lambert at 1 hour and east toward the ridge the next. conserving ammunition by avoiding duplicate missions. Tank destroyer battalions split platoons to backstop infantry companies at key T-junctions, accepting the risk of dispersed employment to guarantee overlapping fields of fire. When German night infiltrations opened a temporary lane, pre-designated counterattack teams, half-tracks with infantry and engineers, drove to the breach under blackout, dropped mines, and withdrew before dawn. Civilian adaptation was a matter of survival. Residents marked wells and cellars for casualty collection. Local police and resistance guided families away from artillery lines and warned of booby traps in abandoned vehicles. Municipal officials recorded property and livestock for later claims, but immediate priorities were water distribution and burial under fire. On the German side of the line, field chaplains and medics organized stretcher chains across orchards to hastily marked aid posts. On the Allied side, mobile surgical teams rotated forward with Canadian and U.S. Corps to shorten evacuation times from ridge and river. Innovation at the micro level accumulated. German engineer sections used explosive hose charges to clear hedgerow cuts for last-minute thrusts. Allied patrols countered with trip flares and taut wire across track mouths. German batteries fired measured smoke to blind observation posts for exactly the minutes needed to move a company across a lane. Allied observers adjusted to fire by sound and flash when visibility failed. Signals on both sides baked redundancy into field telephones with looped circuits. When shelling cut one leg, the net held. Psychological routines stabilized units. Hot tea at first light in Canadian positions, ration hot meals at midnight for U.S. roadblocks, and fixed stand-to cycles that aligned with typical dusk and dawn attacks. German orders emphasized the promise of the Seine crossings. Allied communiques warned troops not to underestimate last-ditch counterattacks, even as prisoner columns grew. By 21st in August, these adaptations had measurable effects. German breakout groups that succeeded did so in platoon or company packets, often abandoning heavy equipment. Those that attempted daylight movement as columns suffered heavy losses to artillery and air. Allied losses continued from close-range night fights and counterattacks, but roadblocks tied to responsive guns denied the reconstitution of large, organized formations. The psychology of both sides reflected the shift. For the trapped force, each hour's opening was precious but shrinking. For the encircling force, the imperative was to avoid overextension, while maintaining a lattice of fire and obstacles that turned the remaining corridors into filters. Resistance and adaptation had narrowed the contest from divisional maneuvers to a struggle of teams and sections at bridges, hedges, and crests, precisely the scale at which the final closures would be decided. The turning point came in a compressed sequence between 20 and 21 August 1944, when the corridor contracted to a handful of lanes and Allied blocks converted movement into attrition. During the night of 20th August, Polish companies on Mont-Ormel repelled converging attacks from Kampfgruppen, drawn out of 2nd SS Panzer and 9th Panzer, while Canadian detachments at Saint-Lambert held the bridge and ford under alternating smoke and high explosive barrages. At first light, U.S. patrols from the 90th Infantry pushed through Chambois toward the dives, linking fires with Polish observers on the crest. Artillery plans clicked into a prearranged cadence. Medium howitzers cut the far bank road at timed intervals. Quick-shift salvos walked along hedgerows when columns tried to bypass wreckage. Fighter bombers attacked road knots at Moissy and the approaches to Vimoutiers when controllers confirmed gaps in cloud and flak. German batteries answered with smoke to blind the crest, and with short defensive bursts covering dusk thrusts. But ammunition tables were thin, many batteries reporting only a few dozen rounds of high explosive and anti-tank for the day. Inside the shrinking pocket, command shifted from division to battalion scale as units broke into groups that could move by orchard margins. Columns that attempted daylight crossings met pre-sighted fire. Wrecks accumulated at lane bends and on the approaches to the dives. Prisoners moved rearward in files past Saint-Lambert and Chambois. By evening of the 20th, Allied tallies from the ring recorded many thousands captured since morning, with counts rising as isolated groups surrendered when their ammunition was gone, or when counterattacks failed to pry open lanes. Yet the closure was not absolute. In darkness, guides led platoon-sized parties through gaps. wading cattle paths and ditch bottoms toward the east bank. The difference lay in scale. Breakouts now removed men, not formations, and heavy equipment was left behind or destroyed in place. On Hill 262, the decisive exchanges unfolded at farmyards and copses. Polish tanks positioned hull down behind the crest engaged assault guns at 500, 800 meters. 17-pounder anti-tank guns covered dead ground. Machine guns swept hedgerow mouths. When German infantry penetrated a fold in the ground, Polish platoons counterattacked a few dozen meters to reoccupy a hedge line, then fell back behind an artillery screen. Ammunition discipline governed survival. Armor-piercing rounds held for assault guns and tanks, high explosive for infantry clumps and soft-skinned vehicles. Canadian regiments in range reinforced with massed salvos. U.S. battalions in Chambois adjusted fires to the ridge when calls came over liaison nets. German counterthrusts, often led by a few tanks with panzer grenadiers on foot, reached the outskirts of Boyos and the northern spur. But each success consumed fuel that could not be replaced and left vehicles exposed at first light. At Saint-Lambert, the bridge and ford became a gauge of decision. Canadian roadblocks, anti-tank guns in barnyards, infantry in houses tied by wire to mortars broke up files that reached the village through smoke. When a party forced the crossing, the far bank was already plotted for artillery. When smoke lifted, observers called strikes that cut the lane anew. Civilian bystanders sheltered in cellars, while wounded from both sides were collected in improvised aid posts. Local police helped steer non-combatants away from the riverfront. The pattern repeated through the 20th. A temporary opening, a rush of vehicles, a cut by artillery or air, and renewed fighting in the streets as rear guards tried to restore flow. Each cycle extracted more personnel from the West Bank, but at the cost of cohesion, and the ratio tilted as Allied blocks thickened. Coordination among national formations produced the closure line. In the afternoon of 25th of August, patrols from the U.S. 359th Infantry reached Polish pickets east of Chambois. During the night, liaison officers deconflicted arcs and artillery zones. At dawn on the 21st, contact was firm on several points. Polish positions held the ridge. Canadian detachments still gripped Saint-Lambert. U.S. companies occupied Chambois and pushed to the dives. German orders called for simultaneous thrusts at first light from inside and outside the pocket to reopen a lane toward Vimoutiers. These attacks struck the Polish flanks and the Canadian bridgehead with company and battalion-sized groups, supported by the last serviceable tanks and assault guns. Several penetrations reached farm enclosures on the crest and the near approaches to the bridge. Counterattacks and artillery reclosed the gaps. By midday, the pace of organized German movement fell sharply. Crossings that succeeded did so in small numbers under smoke and at high loss. Numbers from the turning point framed the outcome without resolving every estimate. Allied formations around the pocket, Canadian 2 Corps, U.S. 15th Corps, elements of British formations east of the Orne, and the Polish 1st Armored Division committed well over 15,000 combat troops in the immediate ring, with artillery groupings capable of firing thousands of rounds per day and tactical air able to concentrate several hundred sorties when weather allowed. German personnel west of the closure line on 20-21 August numbered at least in the tens of thousands. By the evening of the 21st, Allied prisoner counts in the pocket and its approaches ran to roughly 4,000 to 5,000, with killed and wounded in the low tens of thousands, and an undetermined remainder filtering east in small groups. The gap had not been sealed in an instant. It had been constricted to the point that only fragments could pass. Civilian and humanitarian effects reflected the compressed battle space. Evacuation of wounded from Mont-Ormel to Canadian and Polish aid posts required stretcher chains under shelling. U.S. and French ambulances ferried casualties from Chambois and the adjacent lanes. German medical teams staged night movements through orchards toward Vimoutiers, prioritizing those who could be moved on handcarts. Water points were established behind the front on both sides. Burial details operated under supervision to prevent disease in late summer heat. Local authorities recorded bridge damage, livestock losses, and unexploded ordnance locations for later clearance. Operationally, the decision was now irreversible. The counterstroke at Mortain had failed to free mobile forces. The Canadian capture of Falaise and the U.S. advance to Chambois fixed the southern and northern jaws. The Polish occupation of Mont-Ormel and the Canadian hold at Saint-Lambert cut the last efficient exits. Luftwaffe sorties and German artillery no longer sufficed to pry open daylight lanes. Fuel and ammunition shortages constrained every dusk effort. Allied commanders directed troops to maintain blocks rather than pursue beyond the Seine until the pocket disintegrated. German commands issued orders to continue east in small groups and to destroy heavy equipment where recovery was impossible. By nightfall on 21st August, the battle had tipped. Organized German formations could no longer pass the dives in strength. Allied roadblocks and fires fixed the exits. Prisoner columns thickened on the west bank. The turning point consisted not of a single link-up photograph, but of the cumulative effect of artillery grids, air interdiction, and a few battalions positioned on key ground. From this point, the remaining hours would be spent in clearance actions, surrenders in pockets along hedgerows, and a diminishing series of night infiltrations across meadows and ditches, events that defined the end of the pocket and set the terms for what the retreat to the Seine would cost. Combat operations inside the pocket declined rapidly after midday on 21st August 1944 and shifted to clearance, surrender, and pursuit. Night infiltrations continued for several hours along ditch bottoms and meadow paths, but by dawn on the 22nd, organized crossings had ceased. Patrols from U.S. 90th Infantry Division, Canadian detachments at Saint-Lambert, and Polish pickets on Mont-Ormel collected prisoners from hedgerow enclosures and farmyards. Artillery shifted from interdiction schedules to short missions on identified holdouts. Engineers marked and lifted mines along the Chambois-Troon lanes to open routes for ambulances and recovery vehicles. In villages around Moissy and Coudhard, small groups that had bypassed roadblocks laid down arms when ammunition and water ran out. The final perimeter contracted to scattered orchards on the east bank, where rear guards attempted to cover stragglers. These were reduced by company actions and artillery bursts directed by air photos and ground observers. Casualty and prisoner accounting began, while fighting continued in pockets. Allied tallies compiled through 22-23 August recorded roughly 4,000-5,000 prisoners taken in the pocket and its approaches, with thousands more captured in the following days east of the dive. German killed and wounded inside the encirclement are estimated in the low tens of thousands. A variable number, often cited between 2,000 and 5,000, exited in small groups toward Vimoutier and the Seine without heavy equipment. Materiel left behind included several hundred tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned, thousands of soft-skinned vehicles, and large stocks of artillery pieces, mortars, and small arms ammunition. Allied losses over the August battles that created and closed the pocket ran into several thousands. U.S. Corps fighting around Mortain, Argentan, and Chambois. Canadian formations in Totalize and Tractable. Polish, 1st Armored on Hill 262, with more than 1,000 casualties across, killed, wounded, and missing. The ratio reflected a mobile encirclement in which artillery and air power, applied to choke points, generated large prisoner counts relative to ground lost or gained by assault. Withdrawal beyond the pocket unfolded on parallel axes. German commands directed remnants toward the Seine crossings at Rouen, Elbeuf, and downstream points, attempting to establish a line on the east bank. Engineer units built ferries and repaired trestles under air attack. Rear guards formed around battalions with a handful of tanks and assault guns to delay Allied columns on approach roads. Fuel shortages persisted. Many vehicles were destroyed by their crews before reaching the river. On 24-27 August, Allied armies advanced on a broad front. U.S. forces drove on Mantes and Melun. British formations forced crossings near Vernon. Canadian units turned toward Elbeuf and Rouen. Tactical air forces shifted from pocket interdiction to Seine bridges and road nets east of the river, complicating the German attempt to stabilize a defense. Logistics reoriented within days. The mass of abandoned equipment in the pocket required clearance before roads could be used for pursuit. Recovery companies pushed wrecks to verges and marked contaminated sites where ammunition and fuel burned. Allied supply shifted to longer lines as the front moved rapidly. Truck columns established dedicated one-way loops, and the Red Ball Express formalized on 25 August to move fuel and ammunition from Normandy depots toward the Seine. Artillery echelons redistributed ammunition after peak expenditure during the closure. Fighter-bomber groups rotated maintenance after sustained sortie rates. On the German side, loss of vehicles and artillery reduced mobility and firepower for formations that reached the Seine line. Units reformed around cadres with minimal heavy weapons, relying on rivers and towns to anchor a temporary stop line. Civilian consequences were immediate and extensive. The communes between Falaise, Troon, and Chambois faced minefields, unexploded ordnance, and burned-out vehicles in streets and fields. Local authorities organized water distribution and burial details, while Allied civil affairs units surveyed damage and coordinated medical assistance. French medical staff worked alongside Allied surgeons in improvised hospitals. Evacuation of wounded and displaced persons took precedence over property assessment. Bridges, mills, and warehouses on the dives required repair or replacement. Agricultural work resumed slowly as routes were cleared and livestock counted. Resistance groups transitioned from reporting to guard duties at depots and traffic control as Allied columns moved through. Command and organizational adjustments followed the pocket's closure. German headquarters recomposed 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army from surviving staffs and battalions east of the Seine, integrating march groups that reached the river without equipment. Orders emphasized holding the Seine line long enough to pass trains and headquarters deeper into France or Belgium. Requests for replacements and tanks exceeded what depots could supply after losses in Normandy and the Loire. On the Allied side, Corps reallocated divisions for pursuit. Canadian 1st Army prepared to clear the Channel coast and ports. British 2nd Army advanced toward the Somme and Brussels axes. U.S. armies drove across the Seine and oriented on Paris and the Marne crossings. Artillery priorities shifted to counter-mobility and bridge seizure. Air tasking emphasized bridges, rail yards, and columns east of the river. The humanitarian dimension within the pocket persisted beyond the 22nd. Prisoner handling expanded. Temporary enclosures near Troon and Chambois processed thousands per day, with medical triage separating those requiring immediate care. Water and rations were issued under guard, as units organized onward transport to rear camps. Graves registration teams marked sites for later concentration. Engineers mapped contamination from spilled fuel and explosives. Civilian claims registries opened to document damage to homes and farms, a process that would last months after armies passed. Operationally, the withdrawal and aftermath reframed the campaign's theater. The loss of men, vehicles, and guns in the pocket removed much of the immediate German capacity to contest the Seine crossings. Rear guards fought delaying actions, but the coherence required for a continuous defense was absent. Allied pursuit benefited from intact bridges seized or rebuilt quickly, and from the ability to mass transport assets on selected axes. Paris changed hands on 25 August in a separate but related sequence as U.S. and French formations entered the city while German units east of the pocket fell back toward the Seine. By the end of August, Allied forces held bridgeheads on the east bank at multiple points. German commands withdrew toward the Somme and the German frontier with depleted formations. Accounts from participants reflect the mixed character of the withdrawal phase. German soldiers who exited the pocket described night marches through ditches and orchards, the abandonment of guns and vehicles, and the difficulty of reforming units east of the river. Allied infantry recorded the monotony and danger of clearance operations, mine lifting, prisoner escort, and sudden firefights with small groups attempting to hide in hedgerows. Civilians recalled days without water, rationing under shell fire, and the task of clearing homes blocked by wreckage. For all sides, the end of the pocket marked a transition from siege-like compression to rapid movement, with the metrics of success and failure shifting from holding a bridge or ridge to crossing a major river and rebuilding forces for the next phase. The immediate consequences were thus measurable: tens of thousands of prisoners, destroyed or abandoned equipment on a scale that impeded roads for days, and a German retreat that reached the Seine in fragments rather than divisions. The Allied armies, while incurring notable losses in the closing fights, exited the battle with intact command structures, strong artillery, and logistics adapted for long-range pursuit. The aftermath set conditions for operations in late August and September, clearing of Channel ports, advances across northern France and Belgium, and renewed German efforts to establish defensive lines farther east. The Falaise sector itself turned from a battlefield into a corridor of recovery and administration, its fields and villages holding the material residue of the Wehrmacht's last large force in Normandy and the logistical base for the armies moving toward the borders of the Reich. The battle's legacy took shape within days of the pocket's collapse and extended through operational doctrine, coalition politics, and public memory. Strategically, the destruction and disorganization of German 7th Army and large portions of 5th Panzer Army between 7 and 22 August 1944 removed the last coherent field force west of the Seine. Allied advances to and across the river, British crossings near Vernon on 25 to 26 August, U.S. crossings around Mantes and Melun in the same period, owed to the absence of reconstituted German formations able to contest bridgeheads in strength. Paris changed hands on 25 August as a related consequence. German units retreating from the pocket lacked fuel, artillery, and coordination to mount a sustained defense in the capital while also holding the river line. In the following month, Allied armies reached the Somme and the Belgian frontier. German commands fought delaying actions with cadres rather than divisions. The operational map of Western Europe pivoted from a contested lodgment to a breakout and pursuit because the pocket converted weeks of attrition in Normandy into a decisive loss of men and materiel. Quantitative outcomes inform how the battle is weighed. Allied prisoner counts inside and adjacent to the pocket by 22-23. August ran roughly 4,000, 5,000, with thousands more taken east of the dives during the Seine retreat. German killed and wounded within the encirclement are commonly estimated in the low tens of thousands. The number who escaped, often cited between 2,000 and 5,000, comprised fragmented battalions without most of their heavy weapons. Equipment lists recorded several hundred tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned, and many thousands of trucks, cars, and horse-drawn vehicles left in lanes from Train to Chambois and Saint-Lambert. Allied combat losses for the August sequence: U.S. formations at Mortagne, Argentan, and Chambois. Canadian units in Totalize and Tractable. The Polish 1st Armored on Mont Ormel totaled several thousands killed and wounded, a price associated with seizing the ridge and bridge nodes that fixed the exits. The ratio reflected a mobile encirclement in which artillery and air interdiction, integrated with roadblocks, translated maneuver into mass surrenders and equipment captures. Coalition effects were immediate and measurable. Canadian First Army's capture of Falaise and advance to Trône, the Polish division's stand on Hill 2C62, U.S. 15th. Corps' seizure of Chambois and the southern approaches, British containment east of the Orne, and French 2EDB's contributions around Argentan produced a multinational closure that required precise boundary coordination and shared fire control. These practices underpinned subsequent Allied operations across northwest Europe. On the German side, command turnover, Rundstedt to Cluses to Model, coincided with orders that alternated between counterattack and withdrawal. By late August, new headquarters east of the Seine recomposed divisions from survivors without organic artillery parks or transport, limiting counteroffensive potential until autumn. Doctrinal lessons moved quickly into after-action studies. Allied staff cited Falaise as a template for encirclement by converging armies. Fix with one wing, penetrate deeply with the other, then compress exits with artillery grids and air interdiction, while economizing infantry at roadblocks. Air-ground integration, forward air controllers, cab-rank fighter bombers, and core fire direction centers showed that repeated interdiction at choke points could generate operational decision without set-piece assaults on every village. U.S. and Canadian reports emphasized the need for rapid engineer support, Bailey bridging, mine lifting, and recovery, to keep pressure on corridors and to open captured roads for pursuit. German officers recorded the costs of delayed withdrawal, fuel scarcity, and air interdiction. Post-war analyses argued that a timely disengagement to the Seine in early August might have preserved more combat power, but acknowledged that orders and supply conditions made such a move unlikely once Operation Lüttich failed. Civilian and administrative legacies remained visible long after armies moved on. The communes of Falaise, Troon, Chambois, and Saint-Lambert faced clearance of minefields and ordnance, repair of bridges and mills on the dives, and restoration of water and power. Casualty and property registries documented losses. French medical and civil affairs teams worked with Allied units to stabilize services. The agricultural economy resumed as fields were cleared of wrecks and livestock counted. Legal claims for requisitioned or destroyed property continued into the post-war period. These local records, combined with unit diaries and air photographs, anchored later historical work with quantifiable evidence. Historiography and public memory balance recognition of success with continued debate. Analysts compare prisoner counts and materiel losses with the decision to halt U.S. 15th Corps at Argentan on 13th of August. Some argue that a faster south-north closure might have reduced German escape numbers, while others point to the risks of friendly fire and boundary confusion as Canadian columns approached from the north. Studies of air power note high sortie totals by 9th Air Force and RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force, and examine the proportion of vehicles disabled by air versus artillery and demolition. The Polish defense of Mont-Ormel and the Canadian stand at Saint-Lambert are treated as case studies in battalion-scale blocking actions that produce theater-level effects. German operational histories assess the pocket within a sequence that includes the collapse in Brittany, the failure at Mortagne, and the retreat to the Seine, highlighting how command directives and logistic exhaustion interacted. Commemoration formalized within a generation. Memorials at Mont-Ormel, the Mémorial de Mont-Ormel, Saint-Lambert, and Chambois mark positions where companies and battalions held crossings and crests. Museum collections display convoy manifests, map overlays, and gun fragments. Annual ceremonies include representatives of the Canadian, Polish, U.S., British, and French formations that fought the closure. Grave fields and plaques register both military and civilian dead. Educational trails trace the road nets, Argentan to Falaise, Troon to Vimoutier, where the pocket's geometry can still be read against the terrain. The battle's broader significance lies in how a series of operational choices converted a failed counterstroke into a decisive encirclement. The Mortagne attack fixed mobile divisions. Allied penetrations to Argentan and south of Caen placed jaws on either side. The decision to prioritize blocking positions, artillery grids, and air interdiction over deep immediate pursuit ensured that the exits became filters. When the pocket closed, the Wehrmacht in France lost tens of thousands of trained personnel, and the vehicles and guns needed to contest a river line. For the Allies, the closure validated combined arms methods and logistics, truck loops that evolved into the Red Ball Express, rapid engineer bridging, and shared fires across army boundaries that supported the acceleration of the campaign in late August and September. In the memory of participants and the record of operations, the Falaise pocket stands not as a single decisive charge, but as a coordinated compression in which terrain, logistics, and timing determined how a theater turned from attrition in hedgerows to pursuit across a continent.